Basic information has been hard to come by for the people in Myanmar. Under the military's control, journalists have been arrested, non-state-owned newspapers have stopped publishing, and internet outages are frequent. But despite all that, Aye Min Thant has been able to report. Thant was there from the very beginning, giving an eyewitness account of what they were seeing on the streets. They are Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, and they had to flee the country 2 weeks ago, but have been meticulously covering the events. We spoke to them this week about Myanmar's past, present, and future. Here's that conversation.
Aye, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So first off, I just want to ask, how are you doing? Because, it's been an incredibly intense and scary time from everything that we're seeing online about it and the news reports that we are getting. How are you feeling?
I think every hour is a little bit different. The coup, the dynamics of it changes day by day. And, there's some days where, 140 people get killed. And there's some days where you count yourself lucky that it's just one or two. And those are unfortunately now the good days.
Wow.
I think there's a lot of grief and collective mourning that's happening, as well as, a fair bit of anger. And I think a lot of times also quite a lot of joy and this sort of insistently happy defiance. And that's something I've been trying to highlight in my reporting as well, where, the first night when they started using like sound grenades in Yangon, you heard all these like very scary, loud booms going off all over the city. And then out of the darkness, you hear someone yell, "Happy New Year's." And just people refusing to be cowed and just really saying, no matter what's happening, we're going to live our lives and we're going to be happy and there's going to be a future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're really happy that you're now in a safe place and you're actually able to talk to us at all. Can you elaborate a little bit on the last couple of months and, what the day-to-day looked like under the coup while you were in Myanmar?
I think when you're outside the country, it can seem like it's just chaos and violence all the time everywhere. But the violence can get really localized in certain areas. So in Myanmar, what's happening is certain townships, which are like, I guess, districts, the US equivalent would be districts, get really focused on for violence. So in Yangon, the main commercial city, the districts that are being focused on are where the majority of low-wage factory workers are working, where, they're heavily unionized, they're very organized, and they've been part of the leading force of the civil disobedience movement against the coup. Because, they're poorer, they're probably less connected, and sort of violence against the poor is kind of just normalized, right, in a lot of ways, where wealthier neighborhoods are not targeted the same way. And so even in Yangon, where we've had, I think, close to 200 people who've been killed, about 2/5 of the total number have been in this one city. There's some neighborhoods where people are getting manicures and just going out for brunch, and there are other townships where in this very same city there's essentially not a war because it's not two groups of combatants, but just essentially massacres happening.
Wow.
And like life has gotten quite a lot more difficult for the average Myanmar person. Myanmar has been liberalizing for the last 20 years or 10 years, really. And things were looking up. Things weren't perfect. Obviously, there continues to be genocide and human rights violations and all these sorts of things. But sort of absolute poverty was going down. The amount of people who were living under $2 a day had dramatically decreased. And the COVID crisis, now the coup on top of that, has plunged just millions of people back into poverty. And part of the goal of the civil disobedience movement is also to try and stop economic activity and to disrupt the state's ability, and with the military having hijacked the state, to run things like hospitals and schools. Even though people chose this path and are quite committed to it, we can't forget that people have essentially decided to suffer in order to try and fight for democracy.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a real sacrifice.
Tens of thousands of people have been participating in what's being called the civil disobedience movement, or CDM. Can you talk a little bit more about the different ways that people are taking part?
Yeah, I think there's been quite a lot of international focus on the street protests, which, obviously visually it's very striking. And on
Yeah.
February 22nd, which ended up being the largest day of strikes, there was an estimate of anywhere between 2 and 10 million people who took to the public and marched. And Myanmar is a country of 55 million, give or take. So, if the higher estimate is anywhere near accurate, that's a very large amount of the population who took the risk after the military had already shown that they were willing to kill protesters to go out and try to have their voices heard.
In addition to the actual, physical presence, what are some of the other ways that people, are taking part?
Some of the sort of main strategic goals of the civil disobedience movement are to try to deny the military regime legitimacy, funding, and cooperation. So in terms of legitimacy, there's a huge push towards the international community to not associate with the regime, to not speak to them, to not in any way acknowledge them as the government of Myanmar, and to not communicate with them except to try to facilitate dialogue with the elected government, as well as to recognize the elected government and those who are acting as part of the interim civilian government, given, as far as they're able to, given that a large number of elected members of parliament were imprisoned on the first day of the coup. Yeah. And then the move to starve the regime, essentially, of funding. There's been push for sanctions. There's been push for companies to not pay taxes. There's within the country, as well as the sort of international investors and companies like Total, who have been working with state-owned enterprises in gas and energy, as well as on a very individual level of people boycotting military-affiliated brands, as well as refusing to pay taxes as long as that money is going towards the military regime. And then there is the essentially strike movement, where, the Myanmar state is a very big state. And so the government is involved in a lot of people's every day-to-day lives. And so there's a movement of civil servants who are choosing not to go to work, who, are essentially risking not just their salaries, but also their homes. The government provides housing for most civil servants who choose to take it, as well as, their children's education and pensions in the future, given that, we can't know for sure exactly how this is going to end up. And these are all people who have all of their information in a government database where they can just come and essentially arrest you. And we've seen that the regime is not picky about who they arrest. They were looking for one National League for Democracy member, the sort of party that won the most votes in the election. And because he wasn't home, they took his 2-year-old child.
Oh.
Wow.
People are trying to fight this from every possible angle. The civil disobedience movement is the main sort of organizing nonviolent force that's working on this.
And maybe this is not even front of mind at this point, but for those who are involved in strike efforts, how are they getting financial support that they might need over the course of this?
So there's a lot of sort of donations that have been going around. Myanmar is a fairly economically unequal society, and civil servants, like, of what middle class there is, civil servants kind of tend to be the middle class. And so, a decent number of them, especially, teachers, doctors, kind of people in more higher prestige occupations, have maybe their own homes, or they have extra funding and are able to survive. There are also people just organizing housing for people. Homelessness in Myanmar, as in many other countries, isn't a question of the amount of homes. It's a distribution issue. And you also have the public just giving. There's also, sometimes you go into the market and one or two stalls will just say, take if you need, donate if you can. And it's just, street vendors who themselves are not economically privileged saying, we will survive through mutual aid and mutual support.
Yeah. So you've mentioned the military violence, which, is really striking online. The videos that we've seen are horrible. The pictures are terrifying. And, this is happening to protesters and regular civilians. One human rights group estimated that at least 550 civilians have been killed, 46 of them being children. Over 2,700 people have been sentenced or detained. So how has this affected the outlook or the general approach of the resistance movement?
As a sort of essentially leaderless movement, there is obviously a lot of diversity of thought in terms of what the way forward is. There's definitely a significant portion of protesters and anti-coup activists who believe that, either self-defense or active engagement is the way forward. There's been a lot of talk recently about the creation of a federal army, which would involve both civilians who are currently protesting, but also cooperation with the very many ethnic armed organizations in Myanmar. And there's concerns that Myanmar will essentially become a place in which there is sort of full-scale war. And this wouldn't be unfamiliar to a lot of people in the country, in that especially ethnic minorities have been oppressed regardless of who's been in charge of the country for decades. And Myanmar has one of the world's longest running civil wars. They're 70 years deep into wars in certain areas of the country. And so there are these just many groups of small armies and militias around the country that, for now, we mostly see them accompanying protesters in the regions that they're active in order to ensure that these protesters don't get shot. And that's in part why we see more shootings in places like Yangon, where these armed groups are not active. But it's, as more and more engagement happens, it's becoming more and more likely that we will see more violence at a sort of much more dispersed violence throughout the country from multiple angles.
And we had talked about this earlier, but you had to flee the country. What was the point that made you think that it was best to get out, and what have things been like for journalists as of late?
I decided to get out when I thought that sort of my privileges as a U.S. passport holder would essentially provide no more protection. Being a foreign national in Myanmar, you have quite a lot of privileges. And I look Burmese, and so there's visually less protection. Like if I was a blonde white lady, maybe less likely to get accidentally shot. But I decided when they began to target journalists specifically and began to arrest foreign journalists that I would be leaving. Essentially, the week I made that decision, another Burmese American journalist had actually gotten arrested during a raid on his office. And so, this wasn't just kind of trying to prevent reporters from doing their job at the site of protest. This was an active persecution of journalists where they were actively seeking them out. And, I'm too soft for jail.
That's what I always say, yeah. Couldn't be me.
I decided to leave before it was too late for me to leave.
Yeah.
But the situation for journalism is fairly bleak. Although I think there's also hope in that Myanmar people are very creative, and they've lived under dictatorship for a very long time and have found ways to be subversive. And so even with all of these internet shutdowns and cutting mobile data, news is still getting out. People are still figuring out ways to report and to be citizen journalists and to just document and get information out. And there's also been a few essentially newsletters that are starting up now. Now, the newspapers have essentially stopped printing if they're not military run. But there are these sort of like 1 to 2 page pamphlets that people are just passing out in the streets and just going really low tech in the face of these sort of more high tech suppression efforts.
Yeah.
Wow.
I mean, it is poignant that the newspapers aren't coming out. I think that, a lot of our listeners probably can't imagine that. It's very hard for me to imagine a day where we don't get, the official news from somewhere. So yeah, I mean, I'm just grateful for their ability to be creative in that regard. How do you feel about how, Western or international coverage has been about the unrest? What are these outlets getting right? What are they getting wrong? What's your sense of it?
I've had personal issues with some framings of the issue. I know at the very beginning of the coup, Politico came out with, a piece that was well researched but framed awfully. It was like the title was something along the lines of "An Inconvenient Test for the Biden Administration."
Whoa, yeah, really hard for him and his administration.
Yeah,
jeez.
So there's been things like that where the framing is about not the people of Myanmar and about sort of, how is Singapore going to, get sand? Or, I mean, there's not been that much of that, but sort of really about like, how does this impact not the people that are truly should be getting centered? But I think if I had to make sort of more broad critiques, I think there's been a little bit too much focus on the street protests, like especially with television news. Like, it's like street protests are sexy. They look good on camera.
Yeah, exactly. There's lots of people there. You can get a lot of
yeah, and like violence is attention grabbing. Right. But that's not, the street protests are not where this movement is going to succeed or fail. It's really going to be about the discipline of the 3 sort of strategies that I was talking about earlier. This is a fight for legitimacy, right, within the country, but also on the international stage. And I really wish there was more conversation about that and sort of what is happening there, and deeper exploration of the actors at play in Myanmar. I think when we talk about Myanmar coverage, there's just so much focus on how is the U.S. reacting, China, and Aung San Suu Kyi, which, like, I get that. Like, I don't know all of the ethnic armed organizations, and I've worked there for years. It's just like an alphabet soup of confusion. I don't really expect international coverage to like really delve deep into that. But I think in a moment where we're seeing like a people-led revolution and people-led movements all throughout the world, including in the US, it's really frustrating that a lot of sort of mass media is really focused on like what are the leaders doing, the people who are not sort of living with the daily consequences of what the coup actually means.
That's a helpful way to frame it. And circling back to you have grandparents that lived through a coup in the 60s. Your mother marched against a coup in the 80s. Now you are living through this at the moment. Based on all of that, what are your family's feelings as to how this might end?
It really depends on the person. Like, I know my father has essentially just not been home. Like, he's also in LA, and my sister's living at home with him. And she told me, like, he's just never home. Like, he's always at some protest or another, or at some sort of like fundraising drive. Like, she doesn't really even know like everything he's getting up to every day. And like, he's older and he's retired, so he has the time. And like, this is what he's essentially dedicated his life to now. And then I have, family members who have said like they're not going to get involved. They've lived through a coup before. They know how to survive under a military dictatorship. And they know that what you do that upsets the regime does not just affect you. It affects everyone in your family for generations. Like, this is a military that has, and this is a group of generals that have essentially destroyed entire like families and clans. in their pursuit for power, and towards even like, slight disrespect, not even sort of active dissent.
That is tough, these generational curses. But I think it's really poignant that you talk about your family having to just keep fighting back in the ways that work for them and the ways that, they know how. I mean, this is kind of a big picture question, but, what outcomes and changes are you hoping to see after, hopefully this coup ends and hopefully soon? Like, what do you really want to see included in a post-coup constitution?
Myanmar needs a reset, essentially. I think a lot of the problems we're seeing in Myanmar are based on the fact that everything has such sort of deep historical roots. So if we take the Rohingya crisis, which, is kind of the biggest story before the coup that most people knew about, a big part of that crisis is based on citizenship laws in Myanmar, and laws that really tie rights and belonging and access and privileges to your race as determined by, some bureaucrat. And Aung San Suu Kyi, who is now being held by the military and being tried, is being tried under a number of different charges, but the biggest one is the Official Secrets Act, which is a law from the colonial era, where essentially possessing information that could potentially be harmful to the state is a crime. Which, the leader of a nation would have that information.
Right, exactly. Yeah, if they don't have it, who does?
But yeah, like essentially a reimagining of Myanmar that includes people and centers people based on civic and community engagement and participation as the main way in which we decide who belongs to a country. A constitution where the rights and heritage of ethnic minorities and religious minorities are respected. So not just saying, this group of people is allowed to exist and we're not going to essentially ethnically cleanse them, but saying that people have a right to multilingual education. People have a right to practice different forms of land ownership and farming, and communities have and individuals have a right to participate in their government, where, even though Myanmar has elections now, people are not really directly involved in the decision making for their day-to-day lives. And so, yeah, I would want to see a constitution that redistributes power more to individuals and communities, and really grapples with Myanmar's diversity and includes protections for that in a just way.
Yeah.
I hope for that too.
Yeah, we hope for it as well. Well, Aye, thank you so much again for taking the time to speak with us today. Really just unbelievable conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me and for covering the story.
Of course, it's the least we could do. Please stay safe.
Yeah.